we need to talk about the Game of Wool, Britain's Best Knitters, and why I think this TV show is possibly the worst representation of our beloved hobby ever. Originally, I really didn't want to comment. I'm not one for drama, but the show on Channel 4 has now aired 3 episodes, and there's no sign that things are really getting any better. In fact, the issues have become so glaring that I saw one person on Reddit commenting, "At this point, I'm mainly watching for the cute lambs bouncing around the screen." How sad is that? So let's dive into the drama. The promise of the show is quite great. So we have 10 knitters and they compete for the... Well, actually we don't know what they compete for. There's no prize money, there's no pattern book deal promised, no yearly supply of yarn, or maybe a gilded knitting trophy. The only thing we know is that Rowan is recreating the designs of the contestants to sell kits without compensation, so that's something. But let's take a step back and look at the show in detail. There have been 3 episodes so far and all followed the exact same structure. In the first part there was a solo challenge, and in the second part there was a group challenge. And am I the only one who thinks that just doesn't make any sense? I'll talk about the group challenges later, where they totally ignored that no 2 knitters have the same tension and not all things really should be seen. But I digress. In episode 1, they get the challenge to knit a tank top in 12 hours only. And in the second episode, it's a dog outfit, a little bit better. And in episode 3, it's knitting a bathing suit, again in 12 hours. In 12 hours. I consider myself a fast knitter, but I couldn't finish anything that looks respectable in 12 hours. And to stick with the promise of the show, I don't think that makes me a worse knitter. Why the rush? Why is there no time allowed for swatching or blocking? That's like baking a cake without a scale or letting it cool off. It absolutely makes no sense. If they want to test speed, and I mean you could, then, do little speed challenges where the contestants need to knit a certain repeat, and whoever is fastest or whoever finishes the row or round first gets the most points or something like that. That could work. But knitting a whole sweater or a whole tank top in 12 hours, that's just ridiculous. And the thing is, I think they just copied other shows, but in sewing or in cooking, it's more about your knowledge, a firm grasp of designing, and your time organization skills that define how fast you can finish. The sewing machine or the KitchenAid or the oven, they do the speed for all contestants equally. In knitting, speed depends on your age, your dexterity, and it is utterly not related to your skill or knowledge. So it just doesn't make any sense. And really, it's no surprise that none of the results were even remotely cute. I mean, not that we really get to see the designs. They spend more screen time explaining the design choices of the contestants using weird AI art than actually showing the finished garments. And this is episode 2 where they explain how knitting works. Seriously? Who edits this show? But the little we actually get to see is mostly atrocious. Super chunky yarn, weird stitch definition, lopsided hems, and finishing techniques. Where art thou? And I don't say this to slander the skills of the contestants. Clearly, a lot of them are wearing amazing knitwear. And I'd go as far as saying that this is the true reason to watch the show. But the chunky yarn and the time constraints, they just are meant to lead to disaster. Now, I am not going to enter the debate about how they constantly talked about fair knitting when they actually meant stranded knitting. Personally speaking, I feel language evolves, but I will say that it would have been kind of cute to show A, some traditional fair sweaters, and B, show what the judges were actually expecting. I mean, Isaac and Holger in particular were wearing some beautiful fair tops in that episode, but that wasn't even mentioned. Instead, they cast off. And by the way, I think it's just such a horrible term. It sounds like cast out, just like they refer to people who crochet as hookers. It's a pun, hooray, yeah, creativity. But anyway, they cast off the only contestant, Gordon, who actually knits using long double-pointed knitting needles like they used to do on Fair Isle, and then he sticks the armholes again as they do on Fair Isle. So the only contestant doing traditional Fair Isle knitting gets cast out. But he didn't finish his tank top, that's fair. But the judges specifically said that sticking with this particular yarn was a risky choice, when in fact the contrary was the case. The yarn, the chunky yarn they were using, felts faster than you can look at. And it's very interesting to note that Gordon actually recorded the video. I link it to you up in here. You really should watch that. And he said he spotted a mistake, and that's why he basically ripped back half of his tank top. And that's why he couldn't finish. And that could have been a very valid reason to eliminate him. But it gets worse, because then the judges praise a design that uses ladderback jacquard and duplicate stitch. Both have literally nothing to do with traditional Fair Isle knitting. And this is not a single occasion. So for example, in episode 2, by the way, spoiler alert, when Meadow gets eliminated, they notice that she is twisting her stitches. That's a common beginner mistake, fair enough. But instead of helping her correct her mistake, they say that twisted stitches use less yarn than normal stitches and are thus tighter. And that is just simply not true. When you are twisting a stitch, you are always twisting a stitch one row below, where the loop, the amount of yarn the loop takes is already fixed. It gets tighter because you twist it. But it's not using less yarn, and it's not using less yarn when you are creating it on the knitting needle either. So that's just simply false. And in episode 3, they justify the elimination of Stephanie because they claim double crochets are stretchier than single crochets. And that is actually simply not true either. Double crochets are structurally less sound. That is true, but they are actually not really stretchier. And in episode 2, the judges, for example, they claim that moss stitch, which is one of the easiest knit purl combinations for beginners, was difficult to knit when talking with Simon, possibly because he was kind of up for elimination. I don't know. Now, I don't necessarily argue against the general decisions of the judges. From what we've seen on camera, the people that were eliminated delivered the weakest results, so the reason was justified. But I do feel that the judges need to be a lot more careful when they phrase their critique, because as it stands, they rather come across as people who still have a lot to learn about knitting themselves, and that is undermining their authority and the authority of the show. Because if someone tells me moss stitch is difficult, I think they are a beginner and not a master knitter who is fit to judge a show. And the issue really didn't get better in the next episode. So episode 3 has them knitting swimwear. Well, most of them are actually crocheting, and I actually like the fact that they include crochet, because I feel there's often this silly divide between the two crafts that is totally unnecessary. However, they are supposedly looking for Britain's best knitter, so I don't know about that. However, Tom frequently says things like, Knitters, you only have 4 more hours to crochet. And, at least be consistent. Either they are knitters and they're knitting, or they are crocheting and they are crocheters. And please, not hookers. And it's especially kind of weird because Dipti herself says that she is more of a crocheter and only a beginner knitter. So I'm a bit confused. And when they introduce the guest judge for the crocheting in that episode, Jamie Crow, they reduce her to a groundbreaking one-liner where she says, "I really feel that crochet has the potential to be an amazing platform for creativity." Yay! And together with the fact that some of the contestants quite obviously barely crochet, I feel it's almost dismissive in the way they treat this craft with hundreds of years of a history. And all we get to hear is granny squares here, granny squares there. Like this was 90% of what crochet is about. In particular, when said guest judge doesn't really seem to be involved in the final verdict either. I mean, the first challenge, most of the contestants were crocheting. Why didn't she get to say anything about it? She just came in for the group challenge, had 2 lines in between, and then said goodbye. I mean, at least it was a little bit better than the Fair Isle challenge, where no representation from the Shetland Islands was seen on screen. And in fact, I really feel like there was no professional knitter involved during the whole editing process. It's those mistakes, they're jumping at you, they're screaming for your attention, and no one did anything about it. And talking about the group challenge, I don't understand this concept at all. Do you? In the first show, they need to knit a couch cover, one of the great classic knitting patterns besides socks and sweaters. In the second show, they actually get to knit a sweater, and then in the third episode, it is a deck chair. Another timeless classic application of this craft. Now, I don't really want to talk about how hideous the results were because, again, it's super chunky yarn, a ridiculous time constraint, so what can you expect? But more importantly, RuPaul, to quote from another very popular TV show with actually a very similar concept, once famously said, "Drag is not a contact sport." And I don't know about you, but I feel knitting is not a group challenge either. Like, seriously, in episode 3, the judges complained that Holger and Isaac have sewn together the fabric for their deck chair. While I agree that the seam could have been a little bit neater, what exactly did they expect when more than one person works on a single piece of fabric? And they specifically said that granny squares aren't what they are expecting. And, that is even setting aside all the differences in tension between two crafters. I mean, if it's a one-time group challenge where they knit a sweater together, take them out of their comfort zone, where the focus is on, they should have an even tension, neat seams, stuff like that. Fair enough, but a group challenge in every episode? Why? I personally feel that the technical challenge would have been so much more fun to watch. For example, knit an exotic heel for a pair of socks in 2 hours or something like that. Add a pocket to a garment, or add edge stitches to, I don't know, a shawl or something like that in 2 hours. A way to push the contestants past their boundaries, where we can actually get to see these epic fails that make these shows so interesting. Then the knitters would have had more than 12 hours to finish the garments, maybe 18 hours. Instead, we get to hear the judges marveling at how glamorous a certain swimsuit is and how ill-fitting another one is. And again, not to slander any of the contestants, but to me, none of the designs look very glamorous. In fact, most of them look downright atrocious. And one judge actually said skimpy, and that pretty much summed up all the designs I've seen on the show so far. And in the episode with those swimsuits, why was there just one female model? or diver, while there were 5 female knitters remaining, and why were there 2 male models while there was only 3 male knitters left? And I mean, why did the women have to knit a full swimsuit? Why where they had to do special shaping and fitting for the bras and of course the panties, while the men only had to knit swim trunks? And of course the men had to knit an accessory, but if we take a look at the little chalk bag Isaac crocheted and the tool bag Simon knitted and crocheted, I mean, that wasn't exactly a challenging creation. All of them could have knitted or crocheted the exact same thing, a pair of swim trunks for men, or groundbreaking, the men could have knitted a bathing suit as well. Yeah, instead we have this one uncomfortable female diver having her nether parts in close up on national TV saying, well, I wouldn't wear that particular design without something underneath. Yeah, why the sexism? But this brings me directly to my next issue. The contestants have been laboring over the creation for 12 hours and we barely get to see each of them for, well, 10 seconds or so. And in almost all cases, we never get to see the full thing. It's always weirdly zoomed in or cropped. I mean, can we at least get to see the finished objects? I mean, it kind of feels like the only reason to watch this as a knitter is because the contestants themselves are wearing very fabulous shawls and knitwear. Or for example, in episode 2, Holger has brought a little very excellent dog mannequin. And his mannequin then gets used to model all the designs because the producers probably noticed that living dogs do not stay put when you put a lopsided little crochet hat on them. And you know, the divers, they probably didn't feel all that comfortable about the camera zooming in on their crotch area either. And this could have been tested, that this just doesn't work the way they planned it. The weird AI art they use to explain stuff ever so often gets more screen time than the actual knitting and the finished objects. Now, first of all, I mean, you know, every fashion student knows how to draft a pattern using pencil and colors. They could have hired one instead of using AI or whatever that is. And secondly, I want to see knitting. That is why I'm watching the show. Also, there is this weird gap. So take episode 3. The contestants are wearing the exact same thing at the beginning of the week and at the end. Yet there are at least, or supposedly at least 20 hours of knitting in between. 2 full days. Why are all wearing the exact same thing with the exact same hairdo? I mean, I know why the production company is doing that, because if they wear the same thing and if they film everything together, they can, you know, cut things together as they wish. But as an observant viewer, I'm not even sure what's happening anymore, and it kind of implies that knitting wouldn't take any time. And clearly, the contestants knew about the challenges before. Some of them brought pictures from holidays that inspired their designs. And if we want to be frank, complex garments need a swatch, need a draft, need some calculations, and possibly a cutout. None of that seems to be happening on the set for the solo challenges. So, what are we actually watching? Do they knit in a separate room and then on one day they film everything? It sometimes feels like that. To me, it feels like the producers of this show aren't knitters at all. And the whole show is created in a way that they feel it provides the maximum entertainment. But I'm not sure it's working. More often, I feel offended rather than entertained. You know, I'm 43. I'm fully aware of how these TV shows work. The winner is typically not the best in the crowd, and the loser typically gets framed in a way that it makes sense that they had to leave the show. You know, these shows need to be entertaining first, and then it is about the craft. However, I do feel that a lot of the other shows, similar shows, are a lot more clearer when it comes to the judging process. What are the judges expecting and how do they distribute the points? We kind of don't really get to see this. And I think together with the weird yarn choices and the challenge choices, the result is something that has zero to do with knitting at all. In my 35 years of knitting, I have never knitted a deck chair, I have never knitted a couch cover or a swimsuit. I've almost never knitted with super chunky yarn because it just doesn't work, and I've never knitted a dog sweater either. And you know, all my sweaters have been knitted on my own. And you know, there is forcing contestants to leave their comfort zone. But what they are doing is, it feels like they're leaving not even the country, they are leaving our planet behind with these challenges. And when I compare that to baking or sewing shows, I don't feel the divide that strongly. Sure, I mean, my cookies or cakes probably are not covered in 5 pounds of fondant icing, and they don't have this edible sugar superstructure to rival the Empire State Building either. But that is the difference between striped socks and intarsia socks with applied flowers or something like that. And not a deck chair, where when you go to Revelry, you will not find a single pattern. Tons of knitters knit baby wear, cute little hats or singlets, and if you think of home decor, I mean, you could knit a little pillow or something like that. All that can be done in a day using standard needles and standard yarn sizes. When I watch such a show, I want to be wowed. I want to see the epic fails, maybe even some drama between the contestants, and not watch skimpy swimwear and dog outfits that scream animal cruelty more than knitting skill. I mean, I gotta give it to Holger. By the way, he reminds me of Werner Herzog so much. And his deadpan comments and eye rolls, they are pure gold. But on a more serious note, he actually brings so many skills to the show the producer should have been looking for before they pressed the record button. I just feel it is a very poor representation of knitting and what can be achieved with knitting and the typical skills that are required to knit garments, and not swimsuits that can't get wet and don't even cover your nipples, or couch covers you cannot sit on because the yarn is so frail and will felt the second you look at it, or deck chairs you can't sit on either. If there is going to be a second season, and I hope there will be a second season, I hope they will include a knitter who really knows what they are doing and a knitter who can really consult them on the editing process. It really feels like they didn't even do a single test run for the challenges. For example, if the judges would have actually knitted samples for all the challenges, first of all, they could have shown these to the contestants saying, this is what we expect of you. And secondly, the production company could have used that to spot the flaws in the way they model things, in the outcomes they can expect, and so on, beforehand, before airing all that on national TV. I mean, please, do watch the show, support it. It is a great thing that after 20 years we finally get to see, we get our own knitting show and not just baking or sewing or pottery. And I certainly have to admit that I am a knitting professional, and it's a lot harder for me to watch a show like this because my standards are possibly a lot higher than those of any casual knitter. And I have to say, the Game of Wool shows great promise, and it would be a pity if the knitting community ends up tearing it apart and there will never be a second season. But at the same time, I have to admit, I would love to spend a video like this one here discussing the marvelous outfits the contestants created, discussing their design choices, maybe where I disagree with the judges and say, I like this outfit a little bit better, stuff like that. I would love if, non-knitters watched this show and it could inspire them to take up knitting, and the knitters that are watching it, maybe they could be inspired to re-knit the designs of the contestants and buy their patterns from a website or something like that. That would be amazing. Instead, I wasted, 25 minutes on pointing out the most obvious flaw a single screening could have fixed. And that is just such a shame. Anyway, let me know what you think. Comment below, and as always, happy knitting and enjoy the rest of your